Ever get that, like, I don't know, kind of creepy feeling when you're watching a good mystery movie? You know, it kind of where something just feels off.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Well, get ready for that feeling because
Yeah.
today we're going deep, deep into some seriously chilling lighthouse stories.
Ooh, lighthouses.
Yeah, we're talking about Cape Roma Lighthouse in South Carolina and Little Ross Lighthouse in Scotland, places where, well, history and mystery, they just kind of, I don't know, they collide.
Sounds right up our alley.
Right. So if you're into, those captivating stories that kind of keep you up at night, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We've got a whole lot more deep dives coming your way, ones that'll take you to those fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes pretty unsettling corners of the world.
And what's really fascinating about these stories, they're not just your typical ghost stories. I mean, they really give you this glimpse, into a time when life was just, well, way harsher.
Yeah, like back when the sea was a constant threat.
Exactly. And isolation, well, that was just the norm for lighthouse keepers and their families.
All right, so let's set the stage. Let's head to Cape Roma first. Picture this: the coast of South Carolina back in the 1800s.
Oh, I can just imagine.
It was treacherous. Ships were constantly wrecking.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Lighthouses, I mean, those were the only lifeline those sailors had when they were out there navigating those dark and foggy nights.
Yeah, but here's the thing about Cape Roma: there was this problem,
Uh-oh.
and it wasn't even the lighthouse's fault.
Really? What was it then?
So there was this windmill, right, standing tall on Cape Roma, and ships kept mistaking it for the Charleston Lighthouse.
Oh, no.
Can you imagine? These sailors, exhausted, probably disoriented, they see this structure in the distance and think, oh, thank goodness, safety.
Yeah.
But they were wrong. And for some, well, it was too late when they figured it out.
That's awful. It's crazy how such a seemingly small thing could have such devastating consequences.
Absolutely. And things got so bad, I mean, seriously bad, that the National Advocate, that was a paper out of New York City, they published this article in 1816.
About the windmill.
Yeah. And it really captures, the urgency of the whole situation.
Oh, I bet. What'd it say?
Well, they wrote, several vessels have been wrecked and many accidents happened from mistaking the windmill on Cape Roma for the Charleston Light. The safety of vessels and security of persons and property renders it necessary that something should be done to prevent accidents of like nature.
Wow. That's a pretty desperate plea.
They even suggested taking the windmill down, or even better, building a real lighthouse.
So what did they do? Did they take it down?
Well, you'd think they'd jump into action, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But their first attempt to fix things, well, let's just say it was underwhelming.
What did they do?
They decided to just mark the windmill with a cross.
A cross. Seriously. I mean, how would that even be visible from a distance, let alone help anyone tell it apart from a lighthouse?
Exactly. It's like textbook example of a bureaucratic solution that just totally misses the point.
Yeah, that's not going to cut it.
But thankfully, eventually they came to their senses. So in 1827, they built the first Cape Roma lighthouse.
About time.
Right. But it wasn't on Cape Roma itself. It was actually on Raccoon Key, nearby.
Okay, so they finally built a lighthouse. Problem solved, right?
Well, not so fast. This first lighthouse, while, a step in the right direction, it had its own problems.
What do you mean?
Well, for one, it was only 65 feet tall, considered way too short for, such a dangerous area.
Oh, right. Ships needed to be able to see that light from miles away.
Exactly. And then there were complaints about the light itself. People said it was often dim and unreliable.
Oh, man. Imagine being a sailor, finally spotting that light, and then poof, it flickers and fades.
Yeah. Talk about a cruel joke, like
Yeah.
a false promise of safety.
Yeah, that's rough. And, there's another layer to the story that we have to talk about. The construction of this first lighthouse, it actually involved slave labor.
Ugh, yeah. A grim reminder, of the injustices that are just woven into American history.
It's like tragedy was just built into the very foundation of that lighthouse.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And unfortunately, the tragedy of Cape Roma, it goes beyond just shipwrecks and construction.
Yeah.
It's also home to this, well, chilling mystery that's been fueling ghost stories for over a century.
Ooh, okay, this is where it gets really interesting.
Right. This is where the story takes an even darker turn.
I'm all ears.
We're talking about the story of Mrs. Johnson, the lighthouse keeper's wife. Her death in 1873, it's still unsolved to this day.
A lighthouse mystery, huh? This is going to be good. Okay, so picture this. April 8th, 1873. Captain Andrew Johnson, he's the lighthouse keeper, right? He's up in the tower, tending the light, like, a normal night. His wife's down in their residence.
This is pretty ordinary.
Yeah, totally. Until, well, around 9 p.m., Captain Johnson's assistant, Julius Lee, comes up to relieve him from his shift. But get this, just minutes later, Johnson comes running out of the house, yelling that his wife is dead.
Oh my gosh. That's horrifying. I can't even imagine. What happened? What did they find?
Well, when they went inside, it was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Seriously. Mrs. Johnson was lying on the floor, there was blood everywhere, and her throat was cut.
Oh my God. So was it suicide?
Well, that's what Captain Johnson said. But the evidence, it tells a much more complicated story. Like, they found a revolver next to her body, but it hadn't been fired.
Hmm.
It looked like it had jammed or something. But then there was a straight razor, and that seemed to be the weapon that was actually used.
So two potential weapons, but neither one clearly used in the crime. That's so strange.
Yeah, it just adds another layer to the whole mystery. And it gets even weirder. Get this. The room was a mess. Like, it had been ransacked, but the only thing missing was Mrs. Johnson's jewelry. None of her husband's valuables were touched.
That's so bizarre. It's like, I don't know, almost like a staged crime scene or something.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think. And then there's the missing money, too. 10 days before she died, Mrs. Johnson had withdrawn all of their savings from the bank. A lot of money, too, like $1,400.
Wow, that's a lot back then.
Right. And she told the bank her husband needed it for some kind of business deal, but after she died, Captain Johnson denied ever asking her to do that. And the money, just like the jewelry, poof, vanished.
Okay, so we have a mysterious death, a chaotic crime scene, missing money, and a husband with a story that doesn't really add up. It's like, no wonder this case has just sparked so many theories over the years. What are some of the most, popular theories about what happened to her?
Well, some people think maybe Mrs. Johnson was planning on leaving her husband. Maybe she was taking the money and valuables to, start a new life.
Right.
And maybe he found out and confronted her and things escalated.
A crime of passion. I mean, the isolation and tension of their lighthouse life. It could definitely fuel something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Another theory is that maybe someone else was involved, a third party,
Yeah.
someone who knew about the money and, saw an opportunity.
Oh, like maybe she was betrayed by someone close to her? That's scary.
It is. It's unsettling to think that something so violent could happen in a place that's supposed to be about safety and guidance.
Yeah.
And, the mystery gets even deeper when you look at some of the strange things that people have reported happening at Cape Roma after Mrs. Johnson died.
Oh, right. This is where the ghost stories come in.
Exactly. There are all these stories about blood stains that just couldn't be cleaned no matter what anyone tried.
Really?
Yeah. Some people even said that drops of blood would just appear out of nowhere. And then there were the footsteps, these unexplained footsteps that echoed through the lighthouse.
Oh, come on, footsteps. Like someone walking around.
Yeah, like up and down the 195 steps, like someone or something was just pacing inside those walls day and night.
Okay, now that's creepy. Is there any evidence to back up those stories? Or is it all just, local legends?
Hard to say for sure, but the stories, they persist, and they definitely add to that eerie feeling that surrounds Cape Roma Lighthouse. And maybe the most unsettling detail of all, no one knows for sure what happened to Mrs. Johnson's body.
What do you mean?
Because the lighthouse was so remote, she was buried in a temporary grave right there on the grounds.
Right.
But there's no record of her ever being moved.
Oh, wow. So she could still be buried there.
It's possible. So yeah, her remains might still be there right beneath the ground where all these creepy events keep happening.
Oh, that's chilling. It's like the mystery of her death is literally part of the place.
It's a haunting thought, for sure. But for now, let's shift gears, head across the Atlantic to Scotland.
Okay, Scotland.
Yeah, to the rugged coast where another lighthouse mystery awaits us at Little Ross Lighthouse.
From the sunny Carolinas to, well, I'm guessing the not-so-sunny Scotland. It seems like lighthouses, despite what they're supposed to be, they really have a way of attracting darkness and tragedy.
Little Ross Island itself is a fascinating place. It's pretty small, only about 29 acres. And the lighthouse, it just dominates the landscape. And it's really isolated, only reachable by boat or helicopter.
That sounds incredibly lonely.
Oh, it is. And like Cape Roma, Little Ross also had kind of a rough start.
Ooh.
Yeah, see, way back in 1792, there was this guy, Reverend Dr. Robert Muter. He was a big advocate for maritime safety. And he wrote this letter basically begging the authorities to build a lighthouse in the area.
I guess they really needed one.
Yeah, he described the waters there, how treacherous they were, and how so many ships had been lost because there was no light to guide them. He really understood how dangerous it was not to have a lighthouse there.
So what happened? Did they listen to him?
Well, not exactly. It took forever. It wasn't until 1843, more than 50 years later, that Little Ross Lighthouse was finally built.
50 years.
Yeah.
That's crazy. So many shipwrecks and lives lost in those years that could have been prevented.
Yeah, it's a reminder of how slowly things can change sometimes, even when it's so obvious that something needs to be done. Yeah.
But when they finally did build it, Little Ross Lighthouse was amazing. The design was so advanced, it hardly needed any changes over the years.
Wow, that's impressive.
It really shows you how skilled the builders were. But even this amazing lighthouse, it couldn't escape tragedy. In 1960, this really awful murder, it shattered the peace of the island and linked Little Ross Lighthouse with this dark and, well, kind of depressing story.
Oh, yeah, this is a story that David Cullen, the author, came across, right? The one I wrote about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
David had spent a lot of time on Little Ross as a kid, exploring the island. So in August of 1960, he went back with his father. They had no idea they were walking into, well, a nightmare.
It's like one of those mystery novels. You have this idyllic island, everything seems peaceful, and then boom, darkness just takes over.
It really is. And as they approached the cottages where the lighthouse keepers lived, there was this unsettling silence. Like the island itself was holding its breath, waiting for something bad to happen.
So what was the first sign that something was wrong? Well, the first clue was this phone that was ringing and ringing, but no one was answering.
Okay, that's kind of creepy.
It was this constant jarring sound echoing through the stillness, and it just added to the feeling that something was off. And then there was the lighthouse keeper's dog. It was acting really strangely.
What was it doing?
It was clearly distressed, clinging to them like it was scared or trying to warn them about something.
I've heard that animals can sometimes sense things that we can't. Like they pick up on changes in the atmosphere, or even sense danger that we might miss.
Yeah, it's like they have this sixth sense or something, and then they found this rabbit. It was trapped and freaking out under a wooden box.
Just a rabbit.
Yeah, it seems like a small thing, but in that context, it just felt like another sign that something was really, really wrong.
Like the island itself was trying to tell them something.
Exactly. So they were getting more and more worried, and they looked through a window of one of the cottages, and they saw this figure lying in bed, totally still. And at first they thought it was the lighthouse keeper, just sleeping.
But it wasn't.
No, it was the body of Hugh Clark, the lighthouse keeper. He had been shot right in the eye while he was sleeping.
Oh my God, that's awful. Such a senseless, violent act.
It was terrible. And the investigation, of course, immediately focused on Hugh Clark's assistant, Robert Dixon, who had disappeared.
So what was the motive? Was there any bad blood between them?
That's the weird thing. There really wasn't a clear motive. There was some talk about stolen money, but it wasn't a lot of money, not enough to justify murder. And the people who knew both men, they just couldn't believe that they would have had such a serious disagreement that would lead to something like that.
So it seems like a crime without a clear explanation, just a random act of violence.
Yeah, it really does. And to make things even more confusing, Dixon had taken off. He used the lighthouse keeper's dinghy to get to the mainland, then stole his car and just took off. They eventually caught him hundreds of miles away in Yorkshire.
So what happened to him?
Well, they put him on trial for murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. It seemed like an open and shut case. But then, just a few days before its execution, some new evidence came to light that made everyone rethink everything.
What kind of evidence?
It turned out that Dixon had a history of head trauma from an injury he got during the war. And he'd been getting psychiatric care for a long time, and he'd even tried to kill himself before.
So maybe there was more to this story than just, a simple act of murder. Maybe he wasn't in his right mind.
Exactly. This new evidence suggested that his mental state might have been a big factor in what he did, so they changed his sentence, but he still went to prison. And then 2 years later, he died in prison from an overdose.
That's so sad. A really tragic ending to an already dark and heartbreaking story.
Yeah, it really is. And it just shows you that behind every crime, there's a human story. And often those stories are filled with complexities and struggles that we don't see.
Man, these lighthouse stories they're really something, aren't they? So captivating, but they just leave you with so many questions. You know? Like what really happened to Mrs. Johnson at Cape Roma? Was it a crime of passion? Was it a robbery? Or was it, I don't know, something even more sinister?
Yeah.
And then there's Robert Dixon at Little Ross. What would drive someone to do something like that. I
Yeah.
mean, to take a life, especially someone who seemed to be, well, liked by everyone, it's baffling.
It's those unanswered questions, I think, that really make these stories stay with you, you know? They force you to think about, like, the unknown and how complex people can be, especially when you throw in things like isolation and these, well, extreme situations.
Yeah, it's like you said before, that isolation that was so important for, a lighthouse to function, it could also, like, really mess with someone's head.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder how people dealt with that kind of solitary life, especially back then when, communication was so limited.
It's a fascinating part of these stories, for sure. Lighthouses, they were meant to be these symbols of hope, of safety, but they also, well, they represent a certain kind of loneliness that could, I don't know, maybe turn into something darker.
Hmm. It's almost ironic, isn't it? Like these structures that were built to protect people from the dangers of the sea could end up becoming prisons for the people who lived in them.
Yeah. And that brings us to, well, one final thought-provoking question, if you will. If places can hold on to memories, can they also hold on to emotions? Can the, I don't know, the echoes of tragedy, of violence, of despair, can those things linger even long after the actual events are just history?
That's a good question.
Uh,
And it makes you think, whether you believe in ghosts or not, I mean, places like these lighthouses, with all their history, both good and bad, they definitely have a way of, you know, capturing our imagination. They make us feel things.
Oh.
They're reminders that the past, it never really goes away completely. And sometimes the stories we tell about those who came before us, they can be, well, both enlightening and kind of unsettling.
If you're interested in learning more about Little Ross Lighthouse, by the way, I highly recommend David Collins' book, Life and Death on Little Ross. It's a really gripping account of, his experience with everything that happened that summer in 1960. And it gives you this unique perspective on the lives of the lighthouse keepers and how that murder affected the whole island community.
Sounds like a great read for anyone who's, fascinated by true crime or just those mysteries that surround these isolated places. And hey, if you have any spooky lighthouse stories of your own, or maybe some suggestions for future deep dives, we'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. Leave a comment, send us an email. Who knows, maybe your story will be featured on our next exploration of history's hidden corners.
Until then, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and remember, sometimes the most captivating stories, they're the ones that leave us with more questions than answers.